Let me tell you something most LSAT students never realize until it's too late. If you don't learn how to crush flaw questions, you're leaving some of the easiest points on the LSAT behind. Yes, these are the easiest, because unlike other logical reasoning question types that can get weird and abstract, flaw questions are grounded in one core skill: seeing where an argument breaks down. That skill is teachable, it's repeatable, and it's testable, and it shows up constantly. In fact, depending on your exam, you could get 5 to 8 flaw questions across both sections. That's up to 20% of your points in logical reasoning, all coming from one question type. So if you don't have a clear strategy for flaw questions, you are rolling the dice on 1 out of every 5 logical reasoning questions. No bueno. And here's what makes them even more important. Flaw questions don't just test logic. They test your ability to stay calm under pressure. The stimulus usually sounds reasonable. The wording is confident, but it's always broken somewhere. And your job is to slow down, zoom in, and figure out exactly where it fell apart. Once you know how to do that, you stop guessing. You stop getting trapped by close answers. And most importantly, you start winning back points without needing to study for hours every night. That's why I love teaching this skill, because flaw questions are one of those rare places where a small change in your thinking can lead to a big jump in your score fast. So today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to master them. Not in theory, not in the abstract. I'm talking about a clear checklist you can follow step by step so you know exactly what to look for, what to ignore, and how to spot the flaw before LSAC tricks you into picking the wrong answer. Let's get into it. So, what are flaw questions really testing? It's not just your ability to spot bad logic. That's vague. That's what everyone says. What they're actually asking is this: can you tell when someone's conclusion doesn't follow logically from their evidence, even if it sounds persuasive? Because here's the thing. Most flawed arguments on the LSAT sound reasonable on the surface. They're not obviously wrong. They're subtle. So you've got to think like a lawyer. What's missing? What wasn't said? What assumption are they making without proof? Let's break that down. Every LSAT argument gives you 2 key pieces: the evidence, which is usually a fact or a set of observations, and a conclusion, which is the opinion or judgment the author wants you to believe. Flaw questions are asking you to evaluate the relationship between those 2 parts. Does the conclusion actually follow from the evidence? Does it make a logical leap? Does it rely on an assumption that hasn't been proven? If the answer is no, that's where the flaw is hiding. Let me give you a quick, concrete example. Imagine that someone says, "I studied every day for a month and got a 170 on the LSAT. So if you study every day for a month, you'll get a 170 also." Sounds inspiring, right? But pause. What's the conclusion? You'll get a 170 if you study every day. What's the evidence? I studied every day and got a 170. The flaw? They're assuming your situation is exactly like theirs. Same starting point, same background, same materials, same study techniques. But none of that was proven. So the real issue is that the argument jumps from one person's experience to a universal rule without accounting for potential differences. That is the logical gap. And that's exactly what you're doing with every single flaw question. You're not memorizing tricks, you are dissecting the structure of an argument. What was said, what was concluded, and does that move actually make sense? And once you know how to break down arguments like this, you don't just improve your score, you become someone who can spot weak logic in conversations, headlines, legal opinions, and even your own thinking. That's why I say mastering flaw questions isn't just about the LSAT. It's about learning how to think with precision under pressure in real time. That's the skill they are really testing. And that's the skill I'm going to help you build starting right now. So let's talk about something really tactical. How do you recognize a flaw question the moment you see it? Because when you're under time pressure, 25 questions in 35 minutes, You don't want to waste even 5 seconds wondering, wait, what kind of question is this? The good news is, flaw questions are some of the easiest to recognize if you know what to look for. LSAC doesn't try to trick you with the wording. They are surprisingly direct here. Let me walk you through the language you'll see in actual flaw questions. For example, they might say, which one of the following most accurately describes a flaw in the reasoning above? Or, the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that, or, the reasoning in the argument is most flawed because. When you see anything like that, that's your green light. You're being asked to identify the logical error, not the conclusion, not the author's intent, not what would strengthen or weaken the argument, just the flaw, the mistake in reasoning. Now, not every question will say the word flaw outright. Sometimes it'll be phrased as vulnerable to criticism or questionable technique. That is still a flaw question. They're just using different language. And this is important because if you mislabel the question, you'll bring the wrong strategy. And on the LSAT, strategy matters more than knowledge. So here's what I want you to do. From now on, when you do a logical reasoning section, look at the question stem first. This is a strategy I teach all my students and it works like magic. Because once you know that you're dealing with a flaw question, your mindset shifts. You're not trying to understand or agree with the argument. You are actively looking for what's missing or what's messed up. You read the stimulus with one question in mind. Where does this argument fall apart? It's like being a detective. You're not reading for entertainment, you're reading to find the weakness. And that mental shift, knowing what to look for before you even read the stimulus, can easily save you 10 to 15 seconds per question. And that adds up fast across a whole section. So step 1, look at the question stem before the stimulus. Step 2, look for phrases like flaw, vulnerable to criticism, or questionable reasoning. Then, once you know it's a flaw question, read the stimulus with one goal: find the broken logic. If you just do this one simple habit, you'll already be ahead of 90% of test takers. Because most people are still reading every stimulus blindly and reacting after the fact. But you're going to be reading with purpose. Now let's talk about the actual process, because at this point, you know what a flaw question is. You know how to recognize one. But when the clock is ticking and you're staring at a wall of text, what do? Here is the exact 5-step process I teach every single one of my students. It works whether you're scoring in the 140s or the 170s. And once it clicks, it becomes second nature. Let's go through it step by step. Step 1, ID the conclusion. Before you even try to understand the argument, lock down the conclusion. Not what sounds important, not what you agree with, the actual conclusion, the one sentence the author is trying to prove. Here's the test. If you had to summarize the argument in just one sentence, the conclusion is the part that wouldn't make sense on its own. The rest is there to support it. Look for classic conclusion indicators like therefore, thus, so, it follows that, or sometimes it's just stated confidently like an obvious truth. Once you find it, underline it. That is your anchor. Step 2, find the evidence. Now you're working backwards. What is the author using to support that conclusion? This is usually where numbers, studies, examples, or general statements will show up. And the key is, don't get caught up in whether the evidence is true. On the LSAT, you treat all premises as facts, even if you would disagree with them in real life. Your only job here is to identify the evidence, not to evaluate it. Then, step 3, ask the golden question. Now that you've separated the conclusion and the evidence, you want to pause and ask, does this evidence actually prove the conclusion? If not, where's the gap? What assumption is the author making without proving it? That gap is the flaw. And here's where this gets practical. I tell students to write a quick 2 or 3 word label for the flaw right there on your scratch paper. It could be something like cost is not equal to quality, or correlation is not equal to cause, or biased sample, wrong direction, or sufficient not equal to necessary. You don't need full sentences here. just a label to keep your brain locked in. Because once you know the gap, you're no longer reacting to the answer choices, you are predicting them. Step 4, read every choice like a lawyer. Now, and only now, you start looking at the choices. One by one, no skimming. You're not asking here, does this sound smart? You're asking, does this match my prediction? If yes, keep it. If not, eliminate it. And remember, most answer choices are wrong. Not just wrong in general, wrong for this argument. That's why having your own prediction makes everything clearer. You are not debating 5 choices. You're looking for the one that says what you already identified. Then step 5, choose the answer that best describes the gap. Sometimes more than one answer will sound okay, but only one of them nails the flaw exactly, and that's the one you want. It doesn't have to use your exact words, but it should match your idea. If your gap is correlation is not equal to causation, the right answer might say, this argument fails to consider that another factor could explain both variables. That's the same thing, and that is your match. If you find yourself torn between 2 choices, go back to your flaw prediction. Whichever choice lines up best with your original thinking is the one to pick. To recap, find the conclusion, find the evidence, spot the gap, predict the flaw, and pick the answer that matches your prediction. That's the system. It's simple, it's repeatable, and it works. And if you commit to using this method every time you do a flaw question, you'll go from, I kind of see the issue, to this argument falls apart right here, and I know exactly why. All right, so now that you've got the process, let's take it a step further. Because here's what separates high scorers from everyone else. They don't just use the method, they recognize flaw patterns on sight. There are about 24 classic logical fallacies you'll see consistently. But you don't need to memorize all of them. Why? Because 6 flaw types show up again and again, and if you master just these 6, you'll be prepared for the vast majority of common flaws you'll see on test day. So here they are, along with plain English explanations and examples. Flaw type number 1, bad comparisons. These arguments assume that 2 things are the same when they're not. You'll usually see this in arguments that say one thing is better, worse, more efficient, or less dangerous than something else. For example, quote, cooking at home is cheaper than eating out. Therefore, cooking at home is better. What's the flaw? They're comparing based on cost, but they are ignoring other factors like convenience, taste, time, or skill level. Cheaper doesn't automatically mean better. Your prediction should be cost does not equal better. A tempting wrong answer choice might say, the argument fails to consider the nutritional value of food, which sounds smart, but has nothing to do with the flaw. Second major flaw type is correlation is not equal to causation. This is one of LSAC's greatest hits. You see it all the time. The argument sees 2 things happening together and jumps to the conclusion that one caused the other. For example, students who play instruments score higher on the LSAT. Therefore, playing an instrument improves your LSAT score. Might sound good at first, but maybe people who play instruments are more disciplined, or have more money, or already test well. The argument doesn't prove causation, it just assumes it. Your prediction, correlation, does not equal causation. But a trap answer might talk about sample size or timing, but ignore the real issue, which is the question of why these 2 things are connected. Major flaw type number 3, conditional logic mix-ups. These arguments confuse necessary and sufficient conditions. For example, quote, if you go to Harvard, you must have done well on the LSAT. James did well on the LSAT, therefore James went to Harvard. Wrong. Doing well on the LSAT might be required to get into Harvard, but it's not enough on its own. There are tons of high scorers who didn't go to Harvard. Maybe they went to Yale and Stanford. Maybe they went somewhere else and got a lot of scholarship money. This flaw reverses the logic. It treats a necessary condition like it's sufficient. Your prediction should be something like reverses conditions, and common wording in the right answer would say something like confuses a requirement with a guarantee. Major flaw type number 4, a biased or unrepresentative sample. These arguments make a general claim based on a small or biased group. For example, I surveyed 5 of my law school classmates and they all hate legal writing. Therefore, most law students hate legal writing. 5 people is not a very large sample, and they're all from the same class. This sample doesn't represent the larger population, so the conclusion cannot be trusted. Your prediction should be something like unrepresentative sample, and you want to watch out for arguments based on surveys, polls, anecdotes, or focus groups. Major flaw type number 5, confusing numbers and percentages. These arguments treat raw numbers and percentages like they're interchangeable, but they are not. For example, quote, Firm A extended offers to 80% of its interns. Firm B extended offers to 60%. Therefore, Firm A hired more interns than Firm B. Not necessarily. Firm A might have had 5 interns and Firm B might have had 100 interns. A higher percentage doesn't necessarily mean a higher number unless the group sizes are equal. So your prediction, percentage, does not equal absolute. You want to look out for math or comparisons where they don't give exact group sizes. Major flaw type number 6, circular reasoning. And this is one of the most frustrating flaws because it sounds right, but it proves nothing. For example, this law is unfair because it's unjust. Wait, what? That's not an explanation. That's just repeating the same idea in different words. Circular arguments use the conclusion as evidence for itself without adding any new support. So in your prediction, you should note that the conclusion and premise are the same, and you should be asking whether they actually proved anything at all. So these 6 flaws I just outlined, learn them, practice spotting them, and use your 2 or 3 word predictions for each one. Because once you can label these on the fly, like, that's a causation flaw, or that's a bad comparison, everything speeds up. You also stop getting distracted by fancy wording and you go straight to the logical issue. That's how you go from I kind of get it to I see the flaw, I named the flaw, and I chose the answer that describes exactly that flaw. That is a game changer. Now let's talk about where most people lose points even when they understand the flaw. They fall for the trap answers. LSAC is really, really good at writing wrong answers that sound right. They have been perfecting this for decades. So let's go over the most common types of traps they use so you can learn to spot and eliminate them before they cost you points. Trap number 1 is the wrong flaw. This is probably the most common trap and the sneakiest. The answer does describe a logical flaw, and it's a real flaw, even written well, but it's the wrong flaw for this argument. Let's say the actual flaw is correlation does not equal causation, and you see a choice that says the argument is flawed because it assumes that a necessary condition is also sufficient. Yes, that is technically a flaw, but it's not the flaw in this argument, so it's wrong. Always go back to your own prediction. If the answer doesn't mention your label for the flaw, eliminate it even if it sounds smart. The second big trap is out of scope. These answers introduce brand new ideas that the argument never mentioned. This is like someone changing the topic mid-conversation. The argument's about cost, and the answer starts talking about nutrition. Or the argument's about causation, and the answer talks about sample size, even though the argument never mentions a study. These answers might be true or even interesting, but they're not relevant. So always ask, did the original argument even mention this idea? If not, eliminate it. The third big trap is too strong or too weak. These answers take a valid idea and push it to an extreme, or they water it down so much that it becomes meaningless. If it's too strong, you might see language like always, never, only, or must when the argument didn't go that far, or it might be too weak if it says might, could, or possibly when the flaw is clearly present and more direct language is needed. Here's what LSAC is doing with these. They are testing your sensitivity to language. They want to see if you notice when something goes just a little too far or not far enough. So here's what you want to do. Read slowly. Don't skim. Pay attention to the strength of the language and ask, does this match how the argument was actually written? The fourth big trap is when it describes something true, but it wasn't flawed. And this is a subtle one. These answers point out something that's technically accurate about the argument, but not actually a problem. For example, let's say you had a choice that said, the argument assumes that the speaker's opinion is relevant to the issue. Okay, maybe it does. But in this case, maybe the speaker is an expert. Maybe their opinion is relevant. Just because something is assumed doesn't make it a flaw. The question is that assumption a bad one? Does it actually weaken the logic? Ask, is this pointing out a real problem with the reasoning, or is it just stating a harmless fact? If it's not describing something broken, it's not the right answer. Now, trap number 5, mislabels the argument structure. This one is rarer, but it shows up just enough that I wanted to include it. Sometimes LSAT will give you an answer that says, the argument draws a conclusion based on a sample of consumers surveyed. But if you go back to the stimulus, there was no survey, no data, no sample. This is a made-up flaw. It doesn't match the actual argument structure. So you want to check the stimulus and see if the structure they're describing appears or not. If it doesn't, cross it out fast. The big thing I want to recommend for you is to go in with a prediction, because all these traps have one thing in common. They become 10 times more dangerous if you go in without a plan. If you read the choices without already having a sense of the flaw, you're just reacting. You're hoping something sounds good, and that's when LSAT wins. But if you have a 2-word prediction like bad comparison or correlation does not equal causation, you now have a filter. You're not reacting, you're confirming. You're scanning 5 choices and asking, which one says what I already know? That's how you get faster. That's how you get more confident. And that's how you stop second-guessing yourself. Now, let's bring it all together. You've got the method, you know the most common flaw types, and you know how LSAT tries to trick you with tempting wrong answers. So now it's time to apply everything with 2 concrete examples. No theory, no fluff, just you, me, and the kind of logic you're going to see on test day. The first example is the bad comparison flaw. The stimulus says, we should avoid eating at fast food restaurants because they are more expensive than cooking at home. Okay, pause. Step 1, find the conclusion. The recommendation is clear. We should avoid eating at fast food restaurants. That's the conclusion. Step 2, find the evidence. Why? Because fast food is more expensive than home-cooked meals. Step 3, ask, does the evidence prove the conclusion? Not really. The argument is only considering cost. But what about convenience? What about time and energy? What if someone values speed over savings? The argument assumes that cost is the only thing that matters in deciding where to eat. Your prediction should be that cost doesn't necessarily mean better. We're looking for an argument that says the argument ignores other relevant factors when comparing options, or assumes that cost is the only consideration. The correct answer will be something like, the argument fails to consider other factors besides cost that might influence the decision to eat out. Boom, that's your match. And a trap answer might say something like, the argument overlooks the nutritional disadvantages of fast food. Sounds smart, but nowhere in the argument do they talk about nutrition. That's an out-of-scope distraction, so you want to knock it out. Now here is another example, the causal flaw. Stimulus says, students who join extracurricular clubs tend to earn higher grades, therefore, joining a club will improve your grades. Step 1, find the conclusion. If you join a club, your grades will go up. Step 2, evidence. Students who join clubs tend to earn higher grades. Step 3, ask, does the evidence prove the conclusion? No, it does not. It just shows a correlation. 2 things happening together. But it doesn't prove that one causes the other. The argument assumes that joining a club causes better grades, but it never rules out other explanations. Maybe those students are just more motivated, or better at time management, or maybe the kind of student who joins clubs is also the kind who studies more. Prediction, correlation does not equal causation. The right answer would be something like, the argument fails to consider that an external factor might be responsible for both club participation and higher grades. That is exactly the gap we identified. A trap answer might say something like, the argument draws a conclusion based on an unrepresentative sample. There is no mention of a sample size or survey in the argument, so that is not what is wrong here. Another trap might say, the argument fails to define what counts as an extracurricular activity. Nice try, but irrelevant. The flaw is not about definitions. It's about a bad assumption. So here's what I want you to take from this. These two examples are totally different arguments, but we handled them both the same way. We found the conclusion. We ID'd the evidence. We asked whether the evidence proved the conclusion. We spotted the flaw. We predicted what the right answer would need to say. And then we matched the prediction to the right answer choice. That is the method. It's not about memorizing every trick LSAT could possibly pull. It's about slowing down, trusting the process, and learning to label flaws with precision. The more reps you do like this, slow, deliberate, methodical, the more natural it becomes. And pretty soon, you'll start reading arguments and thinking, oh, that's a causation flaw, or that's a classic bad comparison, or, they reversed the conditional. And once that happens, you stop playing defense and you start owning logical reasoning.